So let's start with the opening question. Is higher education working?
Yeah, the question is where. I think higher education is working, but to say that it's without challenges would be insufficient. So I think it's generally works reasonably well. It has a problem which Bill Bowen has called the cost disease. Simple analogy he gives for it. If you take a string quartet and ask them to play Vivaldi's Four Seasons, it takes the same time and it takes the same number of people as it took almost 300 years ago when he wrote that piece. Unfortunately, those guys get paid a lot more than they got paid 300 years ago. We have the same problem in higher education. Costs are driven by salaries. They're driven by salaries of highly educated people, the professors. Their salaries tend to go up faster, not only faster than CPI, but faster than average family income. Increasingly, that delta, particularly in the last 20 years, has become a stress point, coupled with the fact that the states earlier were covering a lot of that differential in cost, but no longer are. California is a great example of that, where the average amount after inflation has dropped precipitously per student in either CSU or UC. We've got to figure out how we're going to solve that problem. In some sense, it's a productivity problem. Simple solution, double all the class sizes. Right? You could double all the class sizes, right? That would improve productivity. But I think we all agree it would lower the quality of the education, the quality of the learning that goes on. So this is the challenge that in the U.S. that we have in higher education. Outside the U.S., higher education is in much deeper problems. It's really stuck in a model which, luckily, our oldest universities are only 350. In Europe, they're 800 years old. They still act like it was 800 years ago in some ways. So they've changed. We've been the beneficiaries of a much more dynamic, more entrepreneurial culture. But we're going to have to change now if we're going to survive and continue to deliver education to young people.
So looking ahead, what disruptions, I mean, I think I've heard you talk about some of the disruptions that technology has done in the music industry and that we all know in the news industry. What's the disruption ahead in higher education?
Well, I think there will be some sort of disruption. Whether or not it's a complete disintegration of the sector, I doubt it. I doubt that an undergraduate residential 4-year experience will be the gold standard and will continue to be the gold standard. The problem is the gold standard is just getting too expensive for many American families. So figuring out how we're going to blend technology in so that we maintain what's special about that kind of experience. Right? Small classes, interaction between faculty members. But the truth is, go to a large lecture, 100, 200 people in the lecture, not much interaction, mostly one-way communication, right? And go to the back of the room and watch what they all have their laptops open. But there's no note-taking going on. There's Facebook open there, there's the web open, there's lots of things going on. Not an effective learning environment anymore, I think. That's a learning environment that I think we probably can figure out how to do online forms of technology as well. And so the key will be, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Keep what's special and reform and improve and increase productivity of other things.
I want to get to the online in a minute. But so, what does an undergraduate education at Stanford cost now?
So the way we talk about this is, so there's list price, obviously. List price is $45,000 in tuition and add another $10,000 for room and board and miscellaneous costs. What's called net price, which is really the thing to compare, is what does the average student pay? So our net price has actually gone down over time, and it's about $25,000 net price. So that's what the average. Now, obviously, a low-income student pays a lot less than that. Students below 60, whose family incomes are below $60,000, we pay both their tuition and their room and board bill. Below $100,000, we pay their tuition bill. So that's what, obviously, an institution like Stanford with a very large endowment can afford to do that. The strain is for institutions. This is a small niche of institutions that can afford those kind of generous financial aid. 90% of the colleges, both by the way, privates and publics, can't afford to do that, and that's where the stress is coming in terms of affordability.
And does that lead to, set Stanford aside, less reliance on need-blind admissions?
Certainly, I think in the financial aid crisis, we saw some institutions move away from need-blind admissions. The other thing you can see is, go to an institution with a large endowment, you will see somebody who is the director of enrollment. Because for them, enrolling full-paying students is absolutely crucial. And just go to private institutions right near, go down to Santa Clara. 75, 80% of their income is tuition. Every financial aid dollar that goes to one family is somebody else's tuition dollar. There isn't a big subsidy from endowment. Just the opposite for us. For us, we have a large subsidy from endowment. Tuition is only about 15% of our overall revenue. So we can afford to do that. But for others, it's a real crisis.
So one of the things that's just really almost exploded in the last 2 or 3 years are the massive open online courses, and Stanford's been a key player in that. Why don't you, if you would, just sort of, I think people think of MOOCs as, there's these MOOC things out here. So if you just talk about what they are, and what they are, what their future is, and what the controversy about them is.
Sure. So, this is, you're close to ground zero for the creation of MOOCs. It was right over at the Computer Science Building, which is about 300 yards away. And they had their origin, actually, not from an attempt to do open online education, but from an attempt to use technology to improve lectures, these large lectures, which I think neither faculty nor students felt were particularly good learning environments. And then Sebastian Thrun, one of our faculty members, announced online, before he bothered to tell his chair, his dean, or anybody else, that he was going to make the course available to everybody in the world. And by the way, it was going to be free. And that's a course, that was a master's level course. Students would typically be paying about $3,000 for that course. So this was an interesting outcome. We figured out eventually how to make this work. We don't actually give credit. We give some kind of certificate, and that's the model the MOOCs have followed. So they are large, open enrollment typically. People just enroll online. There are no requirements before you take the course. Most of them have been free, although there's a movement towards a model now to charge for these in return to give some kind of more authenticated credential that you've actually taken the course and passed the material. Lots of interesting experiences come out of this. When things are free, lots of people sign up. When the going gets tough, like on homeworks and things, lots of people drop out. So the MOOC completion rates have been about 10%. That's obviously not a tractable method in the long term. On the other hand, 30,000 people signed up for an American poetry course out of University of Pennsylvania. That's more people than took American poetry in the last 5 years at all our universities. So even if only 3,000 completed, that was more than took American poetry at all the universities in the US. So there's some, for self-motivated learners and people who want to get ahead on their own, I actually think this is a very viable and a great opportunity, as well as for the parts of the world where higher education is just simply not accessible. Sub-Saharan Africa, 1 student in 20 who completes high school gets to take a college course. 1 in 20. A college course, not an entire degree. So for students in that setting, this provides an access to education. Right now, everybody's trying to figure out what role do they have, how do we use these, what can be done here. And many institutions are beginning to say, look, there's a MOOC thing, maybe we do that for PR and for general good in the world that we can make a contribution to. The real question is, how do we use this technology on the home base, on the home campus, to really improve and tame the cost rise in higher education?
So I want to switch from the narrow issue of MOOCs to kind of a broader canvas. And that's kind of the role of a university like Stanford in the world. What is, beyond educating students, beyond doing research, what do you see as the responsibilities of a university? And I mean, I'm thinking about the various initiatives that Stanford's had, the environmental and so on. So if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think teaching and research are what we do. The real question probably is how should that teaching agenda or research agenda evolve over time to address the bigger issues that we face around the world and in the United States. And I think we've thought a lot about that. I think when we were contemplating where to think about the university, we became increasingly aware that the scale of problems that we face around the world have become gigantic. They're really big, they're really hard, and whether it's what are we going to do about our environment to preserve it for the next generation, whether it's global warming, water will be the next world crisis. It's coming quickly, and I think people have not yet, it's going to be accelerated by climate change issues. People have not really dealt with that. We're using up our planet's resources faster than is sustainable, and our grandchildren are going to suffer unless we address this issue. Big problem. Governments seem inept in solving the problem. They just seem like they can't get it together. They can't make tough decisions. They can't get thinking about long-term problems. They have a hard time focusing on new solutions, novel solutions to the problem. But that's only one of many. We've got issues around the world of failed states. I think, I'm a child of the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall came down, I thought, peace, security, improved standard of living for everybody around the world. That was naive. The world's become a very complicated place. Failed states have become a major issue. We see areas in which, parts of the world in which quality of life has actually gone down in the last 2 decades in parts of Africa rather than continuing to rise. Those problems are all interlinked in a complex way. They're linked around rule of law, around good governance, around issues of corruption, for example. And I think we have to think about those as a globally connected set of things, as well as issues of healthcare and education, which are critical to getting a stable, growing society. So we saw these kinds of larger scale problems. I think we felt that the university had reached a point where it had done what it needed to do to deliver a very high quality undergraduate and graduate education. It had established itself as a strong player in the research environment. And it should try to face outward a little more, and rather than just think about problems that were driven by the concerns within a discipline, ask how it could bring this scholarly capability, this educational capability, to begin to address those problems. And so we embarked on a plan to try to do that, and organize the university in a novel way to try to address these problems without eliminating the disciplines that are the sort of standard of excellence in the university. We began to think about a matrix organization where we could bring together a group of people focused on the environmental problem, for example, from engineering, from earth sciences, from biology, from the medical school, from the law school, from the business school, and really who shared a common interest in trying to solve the environmental challenges that are before us and transition to a sustainable future. And that was a new way of thinking about how to organize the university so that we could address these kinds of problems. And I think, it's still early on. Things in universities take a long time to develop, but I'd say 5 or 6 years out, we're pretty happy with the results so far.
So following up on that, how as a president of a university that is a big and almost unwieldy institution, how do you effect that kind of change?
Well, the old story is that it's like herding cats. And the only way you can get cats to do anything is move the cat food. And the cat food should be very tasty cat food. So you can create incentives for people. You can allocate new faculty positions that are meant to bring people together. I think the most important and influential thing we did was to allocate to each one of these centers, create a new venture fund that would enable the leadership of the institutes to fund new faculty collaborations. And we made a few simple rules. We accept proposals from faculty, at least 2 different faculty from 2 different departments who've never collaborated on something before, but who have a common interest in a problem, whether it be environmental, healthcare related, in the area of peace, security, democracy, quality of life. And that was a really interesting model because it got faculty. It was enough motivation to get people over the energy barrier of reaching out and getting in contact with a colleague and working together. And I think from that perspective, it's worked well for getting that kind of activity going.
So there's a little diversion here. So in venture capital terms, you think in terms of success of, let's say, 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5. What kind of a success rate do you have on these?
So we in general, what we try to do is keep the barrier so the faculty don't have to do a lot of work to put one of these proposals together. They're short, 5 pages. We award typically between 30 and 35% of the submissions actually get an award. Now, people may come back the next year, resubmit, revise it a little bit. But of the ones that actually get awarded, we typically then are able to, they're able to go out and get funding of much larger scale, often 10 times. We might be giving them $100,000 a year for a few years. They're able to go out and get significantly higher funding because that initial venture round enabled them to get a proof of concept. We had a great collaboration going, one of the earliest ones we funded, between faculty members in material science, chemical engineering, and ophthalmology to work on designing an artificial cornea. So in the United States, corneal transplants aren't very difficult to get. We have a good medical system. You can get them. But in the developing world, they're a disaster. There's contamination. There's all kinds of problems. There's inadequate preservation of the corneas. And the other problem is they're a giant problem for our people in the armed forces who often are victims of bombs and other things where there's eye damage and they need a corneal transplant and they're simply not available. So they designed this. They were enabled with the initial grant to develop a prototype, and then they were able to go out and get a large NIH grant, and they're now doing animal clinical studies as a first step towards actually seeing if this solution may work. But that's a good example. People who would never think of working together. I mean, a chemical engineer working with an ophthalmologist. And of course, the ophthalmologist knows a lot about the properties of corneas, but not very much about the properties of the material, while the chemical engineer and the material scientist understand this material very well. So it was a fascinating kind of collaboration.
So that leads to something about sort of like Stanford's culture. And I say one of the things that everybody in this room shares is, I think, is a belief that Stanford is a unique and kind of special place with a unique and kind of special culture. And you have you've been here since 1977. You've now been president of the university longer than anybody since Wally Sterling. What's your and Wally Sterling, who was president when some of the people in this room were fellows. So how would you describe the Stanford culture?
I think, it has many of the same elements that a high-quality academic institution have, right? Focus on excellence, striving to be the best, high respect for individuals and individual capability. But I think what it has that's most unique is it has this sort of bold, entrepreneurial, risk-taking spirit. And it's not just entrepreneurial in the startup sense. Clearly it has that. But it's entrepreneurial in the sense that we're willing to take some big risks and go after big problems and put together things in unique ways. And we try to encourage that across the spectrum. So people will try to think about how they can do something that's really disruptive. My belief is, in the end, that's what universities are really about. If we think about what we hope for, whether it's addressing big world problems or finding new technologies or developing new knowledge that has applicability to human healthcare. What we really want are those disruptive discoveries and inventions. That's what we really want. Those are the things that really change our society in fundamental ways. And I think that's the kind of work we want people to do, and we want to incentivize them to work on.
That entrepreneurial culture has been somewhat controversial, and there was the article in the New Yorker, and also then a recent blog post which said that in some ways Stanford is like a startup with a football team. What are the sort of the pluses and minuses of that? What gets lost?
It generates a lot of jealousy on the East Coast. The reaction to the New York article is very interesting. I think most of my colleagues at institutions on the East Coast said, that's who we want to be. Their reaction wasn't negative. Their reaction was, that's who we want to be. So, there are downsides to it. Sometimes students get too infatuated with the notion of spinning out a company and starting something up, and too focused on doing something which isn't driven by a fundamental discovery, but driven by the notion that they're going to do something quickly and make money. The Instagram situation, which was, in some sense, a fluke. I mean, Instagram was not a fundamental new technology discovery. It was a simple use of existing technology to share photos. It happened that it came along at a time that Facebook desperately needed it to attract a larger audience at a time they were going public. So they got paid $1 billion for a company which you could probably replicate the technology of in a fairly short amount of time. But
that was a Stanford connection?
It's a Stanford alums. Yeah. The blog actually dealt with a company that actually is a startup started by a student who's one of my advisees. And I made him...
You have advisees as president?
Yeah, a few. Not a lot, but a few. An undergraduate student, and who had an interesting idea about a new way to do payment using cell phones. And particularly his focus was starting among college students, but potentially with broader applications. And I told him, I'll give you some advice on how to do this, but only under one condition, and that is that you have a discussion with your parents about how you're going to get your degree done before you go get this company started. And he actually started with something we call StartX. So StartX is a organization, a nonprofit that a bunch of our students started. Mm-hmm. That's a advising, mentoring, and small amounts of funding for student-based startups. And the students started this because they felt that they were not getting a fair shake when they went to the various accelerators or incubators that exist around in the Valley, that in fact they extracted a lot of money and didn't give them very much value for that money. So the students started this, and their plan was, we can have students write proposals, we'll pick a few of them. And by a few, I mean they're probably oversubscribed by 10 to 1 in terms of what percentage they're funding. And we'll give them enough money to go work for the summer on this startup. And by enough money, I mean enough money if you live 6 guys in a house designed for 3 and you eat a lot of beans. And that's what they did. So this team of students got together over the summer, got one of these little proposals, and basically rented a house that normally is rented by business school or law school students, put twice as many students as they put in the house, and worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And at the end of that, they had something pretty interesting. Most of these things fold at the end of the summer. Most of them fold at the end of the summer, which is just fine. They spent the summer working on this. They learned something about technology. They learned something about how hard the entrepreneurial process is and how much it takes to really develop something that's credible. So most of them fold. This one didn't. This one, they built some interesting technology. They got some interest. They got funded. But they all managed to finish their degrees. And I think are off doing their company now. That's great.
So you talked about the East Coast, and Stanford had a very highly visible entrance into the New York college sweepstakes. and then a highly visible exit as well. What did you learn from that experience?
Negotiating with governments is an impossible task. I think I think at the highest level, the city, meaning at the mayor or deputy mayor level, and the university were on the same page, and people at that level understood that this was a long trajectory to build a high-quality institution, and they appreciated the fact that we were not going to sacrifice quality in order to do something quickly. Once you get down below that level, you're talking about an organization which didn't really appreciate, I think, all the differences between a university and, let's say, a land developer, where a land developer is coming in, wants to build an apartment building, and then your job is to extract concessions from them for the community in return for letting them build an apartment building. And they asked, what's the public good from a university? I said, a university is a public good. That's the whole point. You're missing the point here. So we disagreed on some things. We thought this was going to take much longer. We also had a unique proposal. We had a proposal that we would not set up a separate college or sub-institution sitting on the East Coast, that we would have one computer science department with students and faculty distributed in 2 different locations. And we did that because for us, the quality issue was so critical to get right. And that's a much more complicated organization. So we just, when it came to the details, we just couldn't get on the same page. And in the end, the risks that we were asked to take were not worth the few $100 million of land value that they were giving us. So.
Any regrets?
No, I think it was a useful exercise to try to understand. I mean, we spent a lot of time and money on it. That could have been spent on something else, I suppose, but it's not a big deal.
Any thoughts of trying this? Is there any other place that you would think about doing this? I mean, I remember you saying that New York was
kind of New York is a unique place. I mean, I think the real challenge is for us. When it comes to hiring faculty, we're hiring from a very select group of people. There are only a few places in the United States those people really want to live, and that becomes a real key issue in being able to attract them. Same thing about students. I mean, so New York was a different kind of environment and would offer people a different kind of living situation. And we had over the years compiled a list of people who we wanted to recruit from the East Coast, who wouldn't come. Primarily, they had family connections or other things that made it difficult. So we saw this as an opportunity to recruit a bunch of faculty who otherwise we probably couldn't touch.
In the most recent issue of Stanford magazine, you write about your interest or the plans to increase the undergraduate student enrollment. And just to set this up, Stanford was, for a long time, roughly equal with graduate students and undergraduates, and fairly unusual in an academic institution, and the number of graduate students has increased and the undergraduates has not. What's ahead in that? What changes do you think that will cause?
Well, I was partly motivated by this by some sense of moral obligation. The number of applications we have to the university at the undergraduate level has doubled since I've been president. This past year, we admitted 1 student out of every 17 that applied. 1 out of 17. There are 4 to 5 highly qualified students who could easily do the work for each position we have available. As we've seen the college-ready population grow in the U.S., most of the demand has been met by the public institutions, but the public institutions simply don't have the money to do that anymore. They're not going to be able to meet it. And you can see that playing out in our community colleges and the CSU system and the UC system. You see it playing out. Time to degree is lengthened, all kinds of issues there. There are capacity constraints. So I felt an institution with the kind of resources that Stanford had had some obligation to really go look and see whether or not it could increase its undergraduate population without changing the undergraduate experience. And that's the key part of it. I don't think anybody wants to be in a situation where we say, well, we're going to take more students, but by the way, you're not going to be able to take freshman seminars, or you're not going to be able to go study abroad because we're out of space. Or the residential experience. For us, four-year residential experience is a really big part of what it means to be a Stanford student. So we want to preserve those things as we make the change, and that's the limit. And so we'll have to go slow. We'll go slowly in doing this, primarily limited by how much we can build beds. We have to subsidize about half the cost of a dorm, because if we took the cost of a dorm and our build cost and turned that into debt and added to that the maintenance and other things associated with it, our room and board costs would be too high. So we have to subsidize about half of it, and that's going to limit how quickly we can go in this, and that's good, because then we can do things slowly and we can make the other changes we need to ensure that the quality of the experience remains the same.
So what are the numbers here in terms of undergraduates and graduates?
So we're about 6,800 undergraduates, and we're about just south of 8,000 graduate students, I think. Graduate students have grown at about 1% a year. Undergraduates have grown at about 0.2% a year. But all that growth, by the way, in the last 30 years, all that growth has been in the last 10 years. There was essentially no growth for a 20-year period. So.
And one other element of undergraduate education, I think it was 2 years ago, and when the story about the incoming freshman class came in, and I looked, and it was roughly, I think it was 1 out of 6 were the first in their family to attend college. That's not an accident, I would assume. No,
it's really a byproduct of our financial aid changes. When we put in this system where we said, under $60,000, no room and board, no tuition, under 100, no tuition. We did that for a simple reason. Have you ever seen the financial aid form that you have to fill out for college? It's 23 pages long.
Yes, I have.
By the way, families that file a one-sided one-page tax return, or check the box, let the IRS figure out my taxes for me, have to fill in this same form. For lower income families that don't have access to high quality college counseling, guidance counseling, which happens in many parts of our country, this is simply intimidating. They see the sticker price and they think, my God, I'll never get enough financial aid. And I was surprised. I have 2 nephews on Long Island who are headed off to college this coming fall, and they thought the same thing. I can't apply to a place like Brown. Look at the sticker price. My family can't afford this, right? I've got a school teacher and a guy who works as an electronics technician. They can't afford that price. They had no idea about how the financial aid system worked. So we wanted to get a very simple message out to families and say, this is it. So that, coupled with a shift in our admissions policy that says, when we look at a student, we look at how rigorous was their academic program compared to the opportunities that were available to them. So a student who goes to an elite private school, goes to a Palo Alto school district, we expect them to take a lot of AP credit, push themselves academically. A student who goes to a rural school in Modesto, where less than 10% of the high school graduates are probably bound to college, we expect them to have a different kind of profile. We expect them to work hard and to demonstrate their capability, but we don't expect them to have the same kind of academic record in terms of AP courses and the kinds of things that you would see out of a kid in a more privileged district. So
I'm going to open this up in just a minute to questions, but so you might be thinking about that. But I have one last one, which is, you talked about the students in StartX understanding how hard it is, how hard the technology is and how hard it is to start a company. You have started a company, and I'd be interested in sort of like your perspective on that experience, now 30 odd years later, and sort of how that's affected how you looked at things like the economic downturn and Stanford's response to it.
So for me, it was a really a real lesson in things I didn't know, how much I didn't know about how companies worked. I mean, I couldn't read a balance sheet when I started this company. Part of what we've changed is to say, let's at least provide some opportunity for students to get a few courses on what it means to start a company and be an entrepreneur so that they don't make some of the mistakes that I made. And that cost the company probably a year in its development and probably $20 million of investor money. Now that $20 million of investor money meant that was $20 million of stock that the employees didn't own instead of investors. So it was a hard learning lesson for me. I did everything under the sun. I was a salesperson. I did cold calls. Your respect for salespeople goes way up when you go on the sales road and you do cold calls. Boy, does it go way up. So I did that. I learned, I think probably the most important two things I learned. One, we had a financial crisis. We had to do a layoff in the company. And then the CEO asked me as the founder to get up on the Friday morning meeting, all hands meeting, after the layoff, and give the inspiring talk telling the employees why this was still going to be a great company and it was still going to change the world. That was a good lesson for me. You know, when you have to do a layoff and you're laying off, we laid off about a third of our employees. There were about 120 employees in the company. You know the name of most of the people being laid off. It was a tough situation. So I learned, the other thing I learned out of it is decision making in when the situation isn't black and white, which is the reality for many complicated decisions that people in leadership positions have to make. It's not black and white. In a startup company, failure to make that decision is death. You cannot be paralyzed and say, well, I'm going to wait till things clarify themselves. So I think that was a good lesson for me. When the financial aid crisis came, I said, we just lost 27% of our endowment. It is not coming back overnight. Our payout rate, because of the drop in the endowment, has gone to 7.5%. That's not sustainable. If we don't fix it quickly, it's going to take us 10 or 15 years to 10, 12 years to recover from this financial aid crisis. So we made a decision. We made a plan. All the senior executives, starting with the president and provost, took a salary cut. And we laid off a bunch of employees. I said, we're going to get this done. We're going to get it done in 3 months, and we're going to move on. Impossible. Impossible. You can't do it. Not my organization. My organization is special. The only way you can do this in a highly distributed organization is say, everybody's going to take the same cut, push it down. You make the decision as the leader of your organization how to best implement it. We did it by the fall. People had forgotten about it. Things were moving forward. You know, we were rehiring people. Inside of a year after the layoffs, we actually had more employees than we had before the layoffs occurred. So it actually helped us spring back very quickly.
Cool.
But it was the right thing to do. Just wasn't the conventional wisdom.
Okay, question?
Hi, President Hennessy. My name is David Sarno. I'm formerly from the LA Times, and I'm a Knight Fellow this year. So we have a few more days before we get kicked off campus. And it's a great 3 days to spend with all you, so thanks for coming. So my question has to do with some of the global problems that you were mentioning at the beginning and Stanford's role in them. And you mentioned how government hasn't been the most effective in dealing with those. But so what about the business community? Because having taken a class or many classes at the GSB this year, there's this notion of the double bottom line where it's not just profit, but it's a social contribution at the end of the day that businesses can contribute. Is it naive to think that is already or over time will continue to play a role in addressing some of these larger issues?
You know, I actually think the bright star on the horizon is the rise of effective NGOs. NGOs that are informed, that understand the same principles that drive businesses in terms of goals, realizability, transformation of organizations. And I think that's actually a new hope for getting the kinds of changes we need in some cases. You know, in some cases, the academics are partly responsible too. We blew it on the environmental stuff. We've blown it. We have not done a good job of communicating to the public. Now, difficult communication, hard to do. I think made more difficult by the fact that there's now less expertise in scientific fields and explaining complex things in the journalism industry. The fact that newspapers have gotten rid of many of their science writers or cut back on what they're doing has made it even harder. I think the other problem we've had is the notion of balancing viewpoints. Is climate change, human-induced climate change, a reality or not? 95% of the scientists, 98% think yes. Why we decide we have to give an equal voice to the 2% who think it's not strikes me as unusual. It's not the way we would run a democracy. So we've got those kinds of issues. We haven't done a good job in communicating. We generated more panic early on before we had data. But I think we have to think about how we approach these problems differently if we're going to have the kind of impact. And we have to work with industry, with governments, and NGOs. But I don't think government's going to do it alone, unfortunately.
Here. Cheryl Duvall, class of '96. I live in Los Angeles. What's up with all the new buildings? And by that I mean that beds aside, where do the technological innovations intersect with the need for more buildings and space?
Yeah. So the buildings we built on campus fall roughly into two categories. Some of them are to house new efforts and new expansion of new research activities. So we're finishing a building in the engineering quad here, which is going to house a new department, bioengineering department. It's the only department, Stanford, in fact, it's the only bioengineering department in the US that's joint between a medical school and an engineering school. So it's a really novel organization working on incredibly great research and problems. That's a new discipline. It's a new effort for us. We needed to house them. They needed state-of-the-art laboratory space. But most of the rest of the engineering quad, we actually took down buildings and replaced them with new buildings. Those of you that remember the engineering side of campus from an earlier era when I came will remember something that looked like it was out of a World War II kind of industrial slum. I mean, they were ugly buildings, they were low slung, they were scattered, there was no attention to either architecture or campus planning. So walk over at that quad, which goes back to Olmsted's original plan for the campus of building these quads out along the major axes, is really just incredible. And it's all state-of-the-art laboratories inside with all this kind of work. Then there are things we do, other things. The business school, they decided that they needed to renovate their curriculum, teach in a new fashion, and their existing classrooms, which were almost all 65-person amphitheater seating, and they wanted to teach in smaller classes, more interactive things. They needed to build a new set of buildings for that. They have a lot of friends who can afford it.
Hi, I'm Andrea Bernstein. I'm from New York. I was here in 2007. So I'm a New Yorker. I love Stanford. I'm really sad Stanford didn't come to New York. And just hearing about it today,
I'm a New Yorker too, so I'm
sad all over again. So I have a two-part question. One is, are you sad? And number two is, why do you think Cornell, and the joke going around New York at the time that Cornell won the bid was like, Cornell is everybody's safety school. We could have had Stanford. So I'm wondering, why did everybody's safety school get it, not Stanford? I mean, I know that you said what you said, but I'm wondering why you think they were able to overcome the obstacles. Obviously,
because they didn't care. They decided that they couldn't afford to lose it. So they were willing to sign an agreement that we never would have signed. Never would have signed. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a unique opportunity, so which I think would have challenged us in new ways and forced us to contemplate how we operate an institution in two different locations. I think which would have been healthy for us in many ways. So I'm sad that didn't happen. We'll have to think about other ways to broaden our reach and do other things.
Hi, I'm Devin Mitchell. I'm the son of a 2004 Knight Fellow. And my question, and I'm a student myself, not here. I don't know how anyone gets in here. But anyway, my question is about MOOCs. And it's that, as the country has really grown so unequal over the last few decades and college has gotten so expensive, I'm concerned that kind of MOOCs and open online has emerged as a solution that it will just kind of perpetuate that inequality. And are you worried about that? Why am I wrong?
No, I think you're probably right. I think the for-profit educational sector will pursue MOOCs very heavily. Most of the for-profit sector has moved to online. I don't know if you saw this recent news report. There are 500 higher education institutions in the U.S. where the student loan default rate exceeds the graduation rate. Right? The default rate in the for-profit sector is now more than double and going up to triple what it is in the nonprofit sector or the public sector. The graduation rates are abysmal in general. We've got a major problem, and most of the young people going to these for-profit institutions are from the lower socioeconomic classes because they take anybody, regardless of preparation, but they don't graduate very many people, and it's an increasing problem. And by the way, all of us are paying that tab because you're paying it through Pell Grants and you're paying it through loan guarantees. It's going to be a real problem, and if we don't fix it and get some real leadership in the education department to fix it. And Arne Duncan's tried, by the way. He tried. The gainful employment was an attempt to do this. If we don't fix this problem, the student loan system is going to collapse, and then we'll have a real mess, much bigger than the credit card mess at some point if we don't fix it.
Hi, David Aubrey, I'm from class of 1980, and I live in Springfield, Missouri, which is southwest Missouri, the Ozarks. It's Tea Party country. It's very religiously conservative. And this is kind of a difficult angle to get at this, but where I live and among the people I live around, there is a deep sense of resentment against the elite institutions like Stanford, Ivy League schools, East Coast, West Coast versus the heartland, the culture war we have here. And many of the issues that you've raised that Stanford could contribute to, they won't listen to you because you are perceived as left-wing, transgressive, pushing cultural values that are very threatening to heartland America. And this, I think, underlines a lot of our politics and polarization. Is there any way or any way we can, that Stanford and these institutions can, I guess, be more friendly or do better public relations? Because I wear my Stanford T-shirt around the health club, and people look at me. You went there, I get a very hostile reaction.
You just have to say, remember, this is the team that beat Wisconsin in the Rose Bowl. That's all you have to say. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to deal with this problem. I mean, it's as you said, it's not only it's almost an anti-intellectual movement that's occurring. It's not just anti-elite. I mean, look, we have students who come from all kinds of backgrounds, all across the United States, all 50 states, all different kinds of backgrounds and experiences. I think the problem with this anti-intellectual movement is it kind of says it's bad to be smart. Well, in a world where the only way you're going to get a job that gives you a decent standard of living in the U.S. is to be smart and figure out how to get a decent education. That's our only solution. Boy, if we decide we're going to be anti-intellectual, we're not going to care about higher education, we're going to have a real problem because there are other people in the world who will be happy to take the economic opportunities that we've benefited from in the past. So.
Hi, I'm Barbara Skinner, and I actually teach history at Indiana State University, sort of the polar opposite of Stanford in terms of
the first Stanford president came from Indiana. Came from Indiana. We have a deep connection.
But anyway, I've been struck in sort of an impression of this conversation, and your words, sir, all dealing with applied science, engineering, business, environment, all of these things, very important stuff. I teach history, I'm in the humanities, and there has been a national argument or a national conversation about the value of the humanities because, we don't get paid as much, we're not as valued. And, since this is a conversation about the future of higher education, what is Stanford doing to still promote the basic teaching of creative thinking, writing, and to give that
Yeah.
value.
Yeah.
So that was. I'm sorry. I have a link-up question to that on MOOCs, which really quick. Assessment, 30,000 people. This is our biggest concern about these large classes. How do you grade this?
Yeah.
Who's grading?
Yeah.
30,000
Yeah,
essays.
sure.
Okay.
So
thank
I
you.
think, so we're deep believers in liberal education. Every student who comes to Stanford, whether an engineering major, biology major, history major, whatever, sociology major, economics major, has the same core requirements. Same writing requirements, same foreign language requirements, same requirements, distribution requirements in the humanities, social sciences, et cetera. So we believe deeply in that model. I agree with you, the humanities are in a bit of a crisis. It's a national crisis. Certainly the number of majors has fallen significantly at Stanford and other places. Students are much more career focused. And we have to point out to them that the acceptance rate in the medical school, for example, for students from undergraduate humanities majors is the same as it is for biology majors, and the same thing applies in the business school with humanities majors versus economic majors. But it's not the mindset they come in with. And parents are not a help in this, for the most part. They are not a help in this. You're majoring in English? So we have to do a bunch of education. We have to engage students better. I was a member of the National Commission for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on this, that just completed a study on this, on the importance of the humanities. And I think we're going to have to do a better job of articulating that case, particularly as a core part of undergraduate education. And that we really have to do. With respect to the MOOCs, this is why the MOOCs are not the end-all and be-all. If you're going to grade 30,000 or even 1,000 tests, you're obviously today going to have some kind of multiple choice kind of grading. But watch how quickly the technology will move here, and it will improve quickly. SAT writing exams are graded partly by computer. So the SAT writing exam, SAT2 writing exam, once by a person, once by a computer, and only regraded by another person if there's a difference between the computer grade and the person's grade, and that rarely happens. Now, those are largely syntactic. They're not deep semantic, not the kind of thing you would give in a history exam, for example. So that's a limit of the MOOCs. It really is a limit of the MOOCs, and I think something that would have to be overcome if you're ever going to make this technology more useful.
Rose Ciota, I'm in Philadelphia, and I was here in 1990. I'm curious about when you talk about the stress points, how that involves international students. We see some universities are increasing enrollment because they pay full freight.
Right.
Other places, of course, the challenges of you have limited spots and how do you allocate. So if you can just go into that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. While we are knee blind for U.S. students, we're not knee blind for international students. So we have a more limited financial aid amount available for international students. And given our demographic of international students, we have a heavy applicant pool from China, from India. We actually have a fairly large applicant pool from Africa, too. In all three cases, those are students with lots of financial aid. And it's very simple to understand. If you make $40,000 in the U.S. and you have college-bound kids, you're in the lower third of the distribution. If you're in China and you have $40,000 a year and you're sending your kids to college, you're in the upper 1%, 2% of their population in terms of income. So almost all those students need financial aid, and they need a lot of financial aid. So that limits the number of students we can take from abroad that need financial aid. And other institutions will take full payers. What we don't want to do is start taking international students just because they can pay the full amount. We're looking for students that meet the same kind of quality threshold across the board. But we do believe that it's very good to have international students in our class. It's great. When a group of students gets together for dinner, I want to have one student in that group of 10 or 12 who's sitting there who comes from outside the United States, providing a different perspective to the dinner time conversation. And I think that's an important part of what we're trying to achieve.
My name is Tunji Lardner, class of 89. I almost feel I have to make an apology that my question and framing of this conversation has nothing to do with the Ozarks or Indiana. I live and work in Nigeria, so it's a totally different perspective.
Yeah, sure.
On the issue of MOOCs, you'll be glad to know, for instance, that about 2 or 3 of the kids I mentor actually believe in it. They're on Coursera. It was through them I actually got to understand that Stanford was offering these courses. And for them, that's the only access they have to qualitative tertiary education. As to the issue of credentialing and qualifications, I'm sure you walked that down the line. But it's an important thing that the university system is doing to the rest of the world, providing kids who would otherwise don't have access to the learning and knowledge required to be functional, productive citizens. The other part of the question has to do with your outward-facing grand design, trying to solve the world's problems. And I'm interested in that too, also. It's a good thing, because I'd always had the sense that there was certain intellectual insularity about Stanford especially. And I go around and, yes, what's up with those big buildings? I'm saying you have all this magnificent piece of masonry, but what is it doing for the rest of the world? The caveat I always say, because I work in the development field, have a lot of experience internationally in Nigeria, is my caveat is always beware of proffering digital solutions to analog problems. And there's a tendency of doing this top-down heavy design of wanting to save the world without fully understanding the nature and substance and form of the problems you're solving. So my advice, if you're going to do it that way, there's a question, because the assumption that A, you accept my premise, and if you do, then you have to explain how you're going to go ahead and do it. In the design of the matrix, how do you intend to get some kind of a tactical or tactile understanding of the real world problems that are about as far as the farm as anywhere else?
Yeah,
it has to be there for me.
I agree. Okay. So I first of all, I agree with you on what MOOCs can do for parts of the developing world where education simply isn't, higher education simply isn't available. You think we have a problem in this country with over demand. I mean, take a country like Nigeria or Kenya, where the number of students who can go to college as a percent of the population is tiny, tiny, tiny. So there's an issue, and I think that online technology can play an important part both in helping students as well as helping instructors. We believe in the end, if we're going to work on these problems, we have to have feet on the street. It's not just about sitting here publishing papers in journals. So work we're doing, for example, on trying to improve water safety and look at water safety and healthcare and water safety. We have people working in Tanzania. The SEED project, which is a project that we've just started with a $150 million gift from one of our alums, is focused on how do we use entrepreneurship as a way to get economic growth in the poorest parts of the world. They're setting up, their first operation is going to be set up in Ghana, and they're going to be working with local companies trying to help educate them, as well as understand what the issues are with growing companies in these parts of the world and where government reforms are needed. After we do that, we'll probably be opening somewhere in South America and somewhere in Southeast Asia as well, as a way to go after these things.
Okay, we have time for one more question, so we'll do it over here. Alfonso. A brief question or a brief?
Brief question, okay. I'm Alfonso Cuellar. I'm from Colombia, class of 2010. The question has to do with how you choose students to come to Stanford. Because it seems now that all kids, when you're like 8 years old, you have to have solved hunger. By 10, you have to have done gone to the UN. By 12, you have to have, had a startup company. How do you do that? How do you choose it? It seems now that kids have no more fun because they have to do all this stuff.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, this is, I'll tell you two short anecdotes about students. So one of the students that was in this startup that I mentioned that got started by StartX turns out to be the world's Rubik's Cube solution person. Not only can do a Rubik's Cube in 20 seconds, 30 seconds, he can take a Rubik's Cube, look at it, put a blindfold on, and solve it. So this is clearly a unique capability. But those kinds of capabilities run the entire gamut. At the recent, in the spring, we have an event where we invite the students who've been accepted to come out and spend a weekend on campus, live in the dorms, get a feel for campus. I give a talk, the provost gives a talk. So at the beginning of the provost talk, he says, okay, I want to bring out and show you the Stanford Juggling Club now. So some guys come out and they start juggling and, it's going fine, he says. And the provost goes, now we need a volunteer from the audience. So this young man steps up, walks up, he's one of the admitted students, walks up they say, okay, here's how you do this. We're going to show you how to juggle right here. You're going to learn something new on your very first day on campus. So they give him a ball. He starts juggling one ball. They say 2. He starts juggling 2. He says, I think I can handle more. 3. They keep. I can keep going. I'm doing okay. He's got 8 things juggling. Turns out he's the world juggling champion. And he's in the incoming class. So, we're certainly, for a lot of our students, we're looking for students who've done something unique. But not every student has done something that's quite that unique. They have lots of different characteristics. I think we are looking for students who've shown an incredible level of intellectual vigor. Students who love to learn and who will make the most of the time here. Given that we have a limited number of places, we want students who will really engage and approach their education not just as some way to get their job, but really engage deeply in it and be intellectually curious and involved. And we're looking for students who've shown they're going to push themselves. One of the things that happens with Stanford students is we start out picking a group of students who were the top few in their graduating class. Then they come here, and everybody's in the top few in their graduating class. These are students, in many cases, who've never seen a grade that has a curved surface in it. They've only seen one that's triangular shaped. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of students in the intro chemistry course or in the writing course get a B or, God forbid, a C for the first time in their lives. So I think they come to realize that they can demand even more of themselves, that they can really excel. And we want them to learn. We want them to learn to be creative thinkers. We want them to learn to read deeply and critically. We want them to learn to write and communicate well. And I think those are the kinds of long-term, this is why the humanities is so important, because they build the 30-year foundation for somebody to live a life, not just how you get your first job, but how you go into a position of leadership and really help change the world. And that's what we're looking for.
John, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.